Yeah.
So the other thing, though, that I do take them seriously on is their claim that they're not internationalists, right? I think that's right, and I think that's genuine, and I think it's strategic and ideological. I think they really did break with ISIS, and I think they really did break with Al Qaeda. They fought with Al Qaeda. I mean, the break is not theoretical. They've killed each other in significant numbers. And the reason for this is that there is a new phase in the Sunni Islamist and especially like what is called the Salafist jihadist movement, the kind of like super extreme, beyond Muslim Brotherhood, terrorist, totally fanatical kind of Sunni Islamism that I'm talking about here, where the whole thing was born really in Afghanistan during the war against the Soviets, right? And so you had all these Arab Afghans, including bin Laden, was one of these people who had gone to Afghanistan to fight or be administrators or something with the people who became the Taliban and also the people who became the Northern Front, with all the kind of like opposition to all the Muslims who were opposed to the Soviet-backed government in Kabul. All right, so what happens is the Afghans win, the Soviets retreat, and that's the proximate cause for the downfall of the Soviet Union. I mean, it's not the main reason, but it's the proximate cause. It's like the last straw for them, and they go pretty quickly after that. Um, all these Arabs go home or back to the Arab world anyway. They generally leave Afghanistan. Very few hung around, really few. And they went back imbued with a bunch of ideas. Number one, that Ayatollah Khomeini showed that Islamism can win in countries and overthrow very strong, very deep-seated regimes that look, immovable, but they're not. The downfall of the Shah shows that. And that the victory against the Soviet Union shows that Sunni Islamists can win too. It's not just Shiite Islamists who can win. We don't have, you don't have to become a Khomeiniite, which is not possible for these guys. It's completely not transferable to a Sunni ideology for reasons that would bore your listeners to death. But they concluded that they could overthrow their governments and institute a kind of Islamic state in their country. So the biggest example of this was the civil war in Algeria in the 1990s, which was extremely violent, extremely brutal, extremely prolonged, and in which tens of thousands of people died, massacres by both sides all over the countryside, in the mountains, what have you. Ultimately, the government won because ultimately most Algerians didn't want that kind of government, and they were willing to stick with a pseudo-socialist Cuban-style state rather than this, insane Islamic fanatics. And the Islamists became radicalized by their own war, so they began relatively moderate compared to what they became. In the end, the Algerian Islamists who were left fighting became so radical, they performed something called takfir, meaning excommunication of the whole country of Algeria. They said, okay, you're all not Muslims. You're all, takfir it's one of the words used for these groups, these like ISIS, Al Qaeda, these guys I'm talking about in the normal Arab world is takfiri, because no one else does this, right? Everyone else, even the Muslim Brothers, would say, that's for God. You can't. One Muslim can't look at another Muslim and say, "Oh no, you're not a Muslim. I know, and you're not, and therefore you're worthy of something bad,
Yeah.
including maybe death or whatever I want to do to you. It's okay." And this in no way is acceptable, because how can you know what someone really thinks? You can't. You mind reader all of a sudden. This is like blasphemous, because it is absolutely the role of God on Judgment Day, according to the religion, to judge people on their morality and their adherence to the faith and their worthiness of salvation or what have you. This is the idea, the traditional Islamic idea, that only God can judge those things. And
Eh,
these guys come along and do this thing. So calling them takfiri is one of the best ways of distinguishing all these guys from everybody else. because a very, very small group of fanatics who would do this. So the Algerian Islamists were so extreme, they pronounced at the end of the war, they'd become so extreme, they pronounced this on the whole country, twice at least, if not more than that. So they became very extreme, but they were defeated. What happened after that is bin Laden ended up being kicked out of Yemen. And then they wanted to take him to Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis didn't want him. They'd already stripped him of his citizenship and all this stuff. They say he's not allowed in the country. Then the Saudis said, well, we'll take him on condition the Americans will take him from us. Like, we'll take him and then give him to the US. And the US said, absolutely not. So nobody would take him. So he ended up in Afghanistan, and he started writing this crap about the far enemy. Like, we have to defeat the West. We have to attack the US. We have to forget about the local stuff. We have to go after the West. We have to drive the infidels out of the Middle East. Then we can overthrow our governments and do whatever it is we want. But as long as the Americans and the British and the French are around here, we're not going to get anywhere. So that's who we have to attack. And then Ayman Zawahiri, who is the current leader of Al-Qaeda, who is the head of the Egyptian Takfiri movement, went to Afghanistan, and they joined forces and merged their operations. And we have Al-Qaeda as it has been since then, more or less. And that kind of strategy of attacking the far enemy with its apex on 9/11 failed dramatically, right? Because it didn't lead to anything but defeat after defeat for Al-Qaeda. So comes ISIS, which has its own, which grows out of Iraq and Syria. And I'm not going to bore you with the story of how ISIS grew out of Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia.
It's not boring. It's not.
Well,
boring.
It would be. Let me just say, the war in Iraq resurrected Al-Qaeda. We punched ourselves in the face a lot since 9/11 by invading Iraq and then by hanging around in Iraq. One of the things we did was we crushed Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. By getting expelled from Afghanistan, they really lost their credibility. They were kind of dying. But no, we decided to resurrect them by backing really horrible sectarian Shiite regimes like Nouri al-Maliki in Baghdad, and provoking the Sunnis to the point where AQAP, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, basically. No, sorry, it's not AQAP. It was Al-Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, Bilad al-Haramain. Sorry, al-Bahrain. Al-Nahrain. Yeah. Bilad al-Haramain would be Saudi Arabia. It's hard to keep these crazy ideas. They never want to use the name of the countries because they don't want any countries. They want to all the countries, which is one of the reasons why it's been really hard to convince most Palestinians to even consider joining Al-Qaeda or anything like that. They're very nationalistic because they've never had they really want one. Right. So, even like the Hamas guys are like, no, we want a Palestinian Islamic State. So my point is this: they then decided to do something different. ISIS decided to try transnational caliphate movement. So it's not international jihadism attacking the West. Instead, it's seizing parts of Western Iraq and parts of northern and eastern Syria and destroying the border, literally bulldozing all the border crossings and creating this sort of ISIS mini state in Iraq and Syria, based in Raqqa, and so that failed. So my point is that the two trends since the end of the Algerian War and the birth of Al-Qaeda, transnational jihadism aimed at the West, failed. And then the second, the regional caliphate idea of ISIS, that has failed. So what you get now from the Taliban in Afghanistan and now from HTS in Syria is where it's like Back to the Future. We're back to the early 90's when it comes to the Sunni Islamists. Now they want to be very clear that they are not regional, they are not international, they are not transnational, they are only interested in seizing power and ruling in their own country. They both promise moderation, the HTS much more than the Taliban. I still don't believe them in that. I mean, that they're really have a heavy lift to prove that that's the case. But we'll see how they run Aleppo and Hama now. I wouldn't want to, frankly, be living there. Just to conclude, this is the new trend, right? It's nationalist Islamism, nationalist Salafist jihadism, right. which was the case in the 90s. So we're post Bin Laden. So I'm going to be explaining all of this in articles. Stay tuned, read. Yeah.